Let me very warmly welcome you to Wollaston Theological College and also extend a very warm welcome to folk in the country who are watching this live streamed. We also welcome Father Jacob Legada, who's just walked in, the Archbishop Chaplain, and warm welcome to you, Jacob. And Jacob will be doing a panel session with me later on, and then a session on communion by extension. So as I mentioned, this session today is being live streamed to the country. All this technology is a bit scary for me, but I do hope and pray that it all works and that you rural folk are being able to link in okay. I do want to particularly thank our technology whizzes at the back, Mark Davis, the Diocesan Children Youth Ministry Coordinator and a formation student, and also the Reverend Patrick King, the Rector of Fremantle Parish. They have both very generously given their time to getting all this technology working, having some practices, and being with us today. And we're very grateful to you both. So back to you now. I do want to thank you for being here today. Of course, there is an obligation for LPMs to attend a training day, so I'm thanking you for taking that obligation seriously and for actually making the effort to show up today. Please be aware that if there should be any emergency, I don't anticipate that, but if there should be here at the college, then we should gather at the muster station, which is outside on the lawn over on the southwest corner of the site. Most of you will know your way around college, but for those who don't, there are two sets of toilets, one just down the walkway here and the other one on the other side of this building behind us, across from the chapel. I think you were all sent a program, is that right? Did everyone get a program? So you know what's going to happen today pretty much. So morning tea will be at 10:45 and then lunch at 12:15. And our day will conclude with the Eucharist at 2:45, at which Bishop Jeremy will preside and preach. So is there anything else that we need to say at this point? Anyone else need to say anything? Anyone else got a pressing question at the moment to ask? Okay. We're going to just swap computers now. With a bit of luck, this is going to come up. It has. Look at that. That's amazing. Okay, can I just check with our technology guys at the back? Is that sounding okay? Can you all hear me okay? So I want to begin this morning by just saying a warm word of thanks to you on behalf of the diocese for your role as LPMs, your ministries as LPMs. I think we've certainly learned in recent decades just how tremendously important it is for parishes, if they're going to become really lively communities, engaging communities, for ministry to be something that we all share in. One of those ministries is being a lay pastoral minister. Ultimately, I think that is certainly a calling by God. It is a very important ministry amongst the ministries that we formally recognize. And of course, that's reflected in the fact that you're authorized by the Archbishop and you receive a license from the Archbishop for your role. So I want to say a very big thank you, and please keep up your good work in what is pretty tough times for the church today in lots of ways. Let me pose the question, what is an LPM and how different, and what is different from the role of an LA, a liturgical assistant? Well, generally, LPMs have a more public role than liturgical assistants. They have to go an application, which includes screening, reference checks, police checks. After the application is made, of course, you'll be aware that an LPM has to attend a training day. And once that's issued for a new LPM, they then receive a license from the Archbishop. These days, there is unfortunately a lot of paperwork involved in the process of becoming licensed as an LPM. And there are, in fact, these 3 diocesan forms that have to be completed. There's the Form 2, Adult Voluntary Church Worker form. There's Form 8, Volunteer Reference Checks form. And then the specific application, Form 9, for a lay pastoral minister. In addition to that, you need a police check. You need to get a working with children card, and you need to attend a church safe workshop. Now that's a lot of things that you have to do in order to become licensed as LPMs. I'm afraid that's where we find ourselves in the church in 2021, and you'll be aware of the very significant reasons why we as a church community have had to get to this point where all of this paperwork and these checks are necessary. They are necessary in order to help keep our church safe and to see that we can demonstrate to wider society that we're taking all the measures we can to ensure that children and adults are safe in our church communities. So when you may be filling in a renewal form and you're thinking of how bureaucratic all that might feel, remember that you're doing this on behalf of all of us, on behalf of the whole church community, to ensure the safety of children and adults in our church. The LPM licenses, as you'll be aware, last for 3 years, and then they need to be renewed if your parish priest wants you to continue in that role and ministry. You don't need to fill in Forms 2 and 8 again, but you do need to fill in the application form, Form 9, which is also a renewal form for an LPM. If anyone wants a copy of these forms, there are a stack of them down on the back table in the corner. A new LPM should ideally also undergo a commissioning in their local ministry context, in the context of public worship, when the license has been issued and would be formally then presented to them by the rector or chaplain. So all LPMs must attend a training day once a year. So well done for being here, and well done to those who are Zooming in. And LPMs may be licensed, as you will mostly be aware, I'm sure, to do one of the following ministries: reading and conducting authorised services in the church, preaching as requested by the priest, assisting in the administration of Holy Communion. You may be asked to undertake pastoral visiting and any other lay ministry authorised by the Archbishop. And that may include communion by extension using the reserved sacrament. And Father Jacob will be saying more about that later. So this morning, our main focus is going to be on the Eucharist, as that will be the primary context in which city LPMs are involved, the context in which the majority of LPMs participate. I hope that some of the general comments that I'm about to make will also apply to rural LPMs who are often leading morning prayer or possibly praise, prayer and proclamation services in the country. But rural LPMs, you of course also assist clergy, visiting priests when they come into the country to take services in rural communities. If there's time towards the end of this presentation, I will say a little bit at the end about leading morning prayer. So I do want to say that for many of you, what I'm going to say will be very familiar. I hope it will be a refresher, and maybe you'll still be able to pick up some new things with someone different presenting. As I started to plan for this day, the message I got was that there was a need to go over some of the basic things. This time, that wasn't done in the last LPM training day, so that's what we're doing today. I also might say that although I'm standing up here talking to all of you, I don't profess to be an expert in the liturgical role of an LPM. I am an experienced parish priest, so I've worked with LPMs for a very long time. I can see one of them smiling over there. But I'm doing my best to share my knowledge and experience with you, and there may be some things you can teach me as well today that I can learn. One of the things I want to give a bit of emphasis to is that it's actually a huge privilege. It's an honour to be chosen and asked to undertake the ministry of assisting in the role of worship. And partly because of that, and partly because ultimately we're doing it for God, it's important to be as well prepared as we can so that we can undertake our role in the best way possible. And I would always say that a part of that should be some prayer time before you begin this ministry, either at home before you come to church or when you get to church. And I want to make the point that leading worship potentially can make a very big difference to the worship experience of those who will be with you, your fellow worshippers in church on a particular morning. And when you think about that, that's a bit scary. It's a profoundly important reality. What we do in the leading of worship can potentially make a big difference to the worship experience that our fellow worshippers have. So please remember that, because that's really important. It is possible to lead worship in a way that is distracting for people. It's possible to lead worship in a way that feels like you're just going through the motions. It's possible to lead worship in a way that doesn't really feel authentic. All of those things can be barriers to our fellow worshippers really engaging with the presence of God. On the other hand, it's possible to lead worship in a way that really evokes a sense of God's presence, evokes a sense of helping people move out of their headspace as they come to church on a particular morning into some place of deeper encounter with the living God who is, as Jesus promised, among us whenever we gather in his name. Now, many LPMs will wear an alb, and I would say if you do wear an alb, try and have one that fits reasonably well. Can be a bit distracting to have an LPM moving around the front of the church if their albs coming up to their knees. It's important, I think, too, that the alb looks neat. You look professional and neat and dignified in wearing your alb. If it's all scrunched up or it's got dirty marks all over it, it doesn't feel like you're taking this role really seriously. Many, many years ago, when I was in theological college in England, I had to help lead a chapel service one morning with one of the staff members. And after the service, he came to me and he said, "Don't you ever wear those shoes again." They were hush puppies or something, I think. He was very offended by what I had worn. I thought it was a bit over the top at the time, and maybe it still was a bit over the top, but it really doesn't look good to wear sneakers or sand shoes leading worship. At the end of the day, it's up to you and perhaps your priest to work out what you wear. But I think, wear on your feet, I think it's helpful to looking dignified and professional if you're in something like some shoes rather than a pair of sneakers or walkers. Another little obvious point is do get there in good time. I always say to my LPMs, be there at least half an hour before the service starts, because if you're getting there 10 minutes before the service starts, you're going to be rushed getting everything ready, and you're going to look rushed, you're going to feel rushed, and that won't convey to your fellow worshippers that sense that's important, that you are there to help them engage with God in this worship act. I mentioned the manner in which we lead worship is really important. And it's important that the parts that we lead, we introduce those with a sense of meaning and a sense of reverence. Generally, in my experience, after you've started leading off, you might be leading the Gloria or the Creed, for example. It's generally better to lower your voice a bit and then let the presiding priest provide the lead with the speed and the volume. Generally, the clergy are more experienced than you will be at doing that, and they are pretty used to listening to the congregation and whether it would be helpful to slow things down a little bit, speed things up a little bit. So generally, I think it's better to let the presiding priest take the main lead in the leading of things like the Gloria and the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and so on. And certainly it's important, and especially if you're an LPM leading a morning prayer service or something, that you're listening carefully to the congregation and you don't get out of sync with the congregation in terms of speed. It's easy sometimes for congregations to start to say the creed, or it might be the Lord's Prayer together, whatever it is, very quickly. And it's really primarily up to the priest to address that if it's a matter that gets to a point where it needs addressing. Bishop Jeremy is going to be talking in detail about this later, but when you're leading, be careful not to rush. If you're a bit nervous, it's easy to say things too quickly, to speed through what you're saying as you lead. So it's important to resist the temptation to do that. You don't want to speak too slowly, but you certainly don't want to speak too quickly either. Another point that is important is when you're liturgically leading people in worship, it's important to mean what you are leading, to try and be really authentic. If you're leading a prayer such as the Lord's Prayer, pray the prayer. Don't just read the prayer. Allow the meaning of the words to be impacting on you so that you are conveying to your fellow worshippers a sense of attending prayerfully to the meaning of what you're leading. If it's a prayer, then obviously it's a prayer to God. You're talking to God, and your role is to help others also talk to God and engage with God. So before the start of the service, it's important to obviously to check with your priest. So you are quite clear about your role, about what it is that you'll be doing and what it is that the priest will be doing, and what other people may be doing in the service as well. Can I just digress at this moment to say that when I have finished this session, what I'm going to say, we have got a 20-minute time for Q&A, and Reverend Jacob, Father Jacob, is going to come and join me on a little panel, so there'll be quite a lot of time for some questions later if you've got them. So just back to the point about being quite clear before the service starts about who's doing what. If you're trying to work out with your priest or someone else assisting during the service who's doing what, that detracts from worship. It doesn't feel to the congregation that you really know what you are doing, and it doesn't convey a sense of reverence about leading the worship. If you're serving as well, as many of you would be, then it's important clearly to attend carefully to setting up everything on the credence table so that that's all ready for the Eucharist. And we're going to be going through all of that in a little while. Important to have the Bible readings ready. That may be your task, or it may be the task of someone else. But if you're the LPM for the day, it's a very good thing to check and to make sure that has happened if you're not the one doing it. Lighting candles, you may be responsible for doing that. It's easy if you're a bit rushed to forget to light the candles. Again, that's part of good preparation for the worship, and important also to light the Paschal candle as it's appropriate for the season. So these are, sorry, these are all just little points to think about and to remind you about in relation to the leading of worship. And another of those concerns how we move around in the sanctuary. Again, we can do that in a way that's a bit distracting, that draws attention to ourselves, or we can do it in a way that is not distracting, that doesn't draw attention to ourselves. So again, it's a matter to give a bit of thought to move around in the sanctuary in a way that reflects a sense of dignity and reverence, and that you're carrying out your role in a professional kind of way. I posed the question there, how might we do that? What do we need to attend to in order to be trying to do that? Anyone got a comment or a reflection about that? What does it mean to try and be doing that, moving around the sanctuary in a way that's not distracting?
No unnecessary movement. Seem as still as possible. Stand quietly by the altar when you're going through the vote.
Okay, thank you. So the suggestion was that we don't make unnecessary movements, and we just stand near to the altar during the Thanksgiving prayer. Okay, any other comments? Sorry?
Quiet shoes.
Thank you. Okay, that's a good point. Avoiding wearing a pair of shoes that might have you clip-clopping around the sanctuary, particularly if you've got wooden floors in your church community.
Is there a correct way in order of lighting the candles?
Is there a correct way, order in lighting the candles? That's a good question. I don't think I know the answer to that. I think my response would be to say, no, there isn't, but I may be wrong about that. Father Patrick, can you give us any advice about that?
Oh, look, technically there is, if you were to read the manuals, but
There we have the correct answer.
very few people would do that these days, and I think the answer would be do so reverently.
Okay, thank you very much, Father Patrick.
I was always told that the gospel candle should never stand alone. So
Okay,
it should always be the first one the last one you're with.
okay. Thank you for that. So the suggestion was that the gospel candle should never be left alone. So that's a guide to, if we want to follow that pattern of how we manage the candle lighting and putting out.
Can you explain what you mean by that? I've been taught both ways. This one first, or that one first.
Okay,
The gospel candle is the one next to the lectern.
yep.
Yes, but you said don't leave it alone.
It shouldn't stand alone. It shouldn't be a light alone. The other candle is
Okay, so do you mean you light it first?
you light second.
Light it second and put it out second? First, okay. So the suggestion is you light the candlestick nearest to the lectern second, and you put it out first. Okay, so there's a few different models and patterns about doing this. For myself personally, I don't think it's too important. The most important thing is to remember to light the candles. Okay, we're going to push on. Okay, so we're going to now run through what we need to do to set up for the Eucharist. And I'm going to ask one of our formation students, Graham, to come out and help me do this. I'm now getting warm, so I'm going to take my jacket off. So imagine you're now in the vestry and you're getting the communion vessels ready to take out, to put on the credence table. You're about 25 minutes before the service starts when you're doing this, so you're in very good time. And the first thing you might want to do is take the chalice. So Graham, if you just take the chalice there, and then we put a folded purificator on top of the chalice. Then we put the paten on top of that. Then we'd select a large wafer, either one of the very big ones that breaks into 24, or a smaller priest's wafer. In this case, we've got the bigger ones. So we take one of those and put it on the paten. If we've got a large congregation, we might be putting 2 or 3 of those on the paten. We then put the pall. So the pall is the little square, usually a bit of cloth with a bit of cardboard or something firm in it like that, and that goes on top. I did look up, by the way, where the word pall comes from, and a palla was a throw that women in ancient Rome would put over their shoulders. And somehow the word has come to be used in English now to refer to this little square thing that we put over the top of the chalice. Then we would have a folded corporal, the white cloth that goes down on the altar, first of all. So the corporal would go on top of the pall. Many parishes these days don't use a bursen veil, and they would just have the chalice put on the credence table like that, and then pass to the priest like that. In some parishes, and it used always to be the case, a bursen veil would be used. Maybe, Graham, you can just move things a bit and put the the veil over the chalice to show how that goes. So we put the veil with the cross at the front. That's fine. Okay. That looks great. And sometimes the veil can be just turned up a bit like that. You can do it either way. So that's, and then the burse just sits on top. And in a parish where you're using a bursen veil, you might have the corporal and the pall inside the veil, or perhaps just the corporal. So when that's done, you've got the wine and water cruvets to prepare with some wine and water, and that's been done. It's always a good idea to have some extra wafers on your credence table in case unexpectedly you have a party of 30 people arrive. And so you can be well prepared. So you want a little pyx or bread box with some small wafers in it that's available for use. These days it's important also to have some gluten-free wafers. So you'll have another little pyx of some kind with some gluten-free wafers available as well. Then you want to have a water jug with some water, filled with water, and a little lavabo bowl and a lavabo towel. So all of those things you need to have set up and ready, and they then would get moved out to the credence table. So Graham, maybe you can just move them one by one over to here.
Rick, sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
Can I share a handy tip about
Sure.
how to remember the order of it?
Sure.
And it's actually a tip I got from, a tip I recently heard from Archdeacon Angela Webb. And she said, construct it like a sandwich. So what did she mean by that? Let's start off like that. Hard, soft. Hard. Soft. So that's the easiest way of remembering it.
Thank you very much indeed, Jacob. Very helpful tip. Thank you. So we'll invite Graham now just to move the things over, imagining they're all coming out onto the credence table. Just pop them down, Graham, yep. So just move the other things over, Graham.
Oh, as if it was the credence tab.
Yes,
Sure.
yes. One thing I didn't mention that's important these days is the hand sanitizer. So I'm sure you all got hand sanitizer in your parishes. You have them in the foyer, you have them in the vestry ready to put out on the credence table. So here we've got a bottle of hand sanitizer as well. So all of those things need to go out to the credence table. We'll come back to the offertory and what we do at the offertory in a minute, but just think of yourselves as still involved in the process of setting things up for worship. Sorry about my croaky voice. It's important to make sure, obviously, that you've got your books and materials ready on your own prayer desk where you're going to sit. Certainly not a good look if you come into your place in worship, you're about to start and you suddenly realize you haven't got a prayer book, a copy of the service, or the pew sheet's missing or something. It's also a good idea to just double check that the celebrant, the presiding priest or bishop, has the books that they will need in their place as well. And you may also attend to just making sure there's a glass of water available for the presiding priest or bishop, and for yourself if you feel you would like one. There are certain things in a prayer book for Australia that the rubrics specify are to be done by the priest, and it's important that as LPMs we're very clear about what they are. So the greeting, the absolution, the collect for the day, the greeting of peace, the great thanksgiving, the breaking of the bread, the prayer after communion, and the blessing. They're all the section numbers in APBA there. So all of those are specifically and only parts of the service that are led by the presiding priest or bishop. If you're in a parish that has no deacon, and most of you will be in that situation, you effectively may become the deacon of the Eucharist. And in consultation with your parish priest, you may then lead into or say as appropriate the following components in the service if you're acting as the deacon of the Eucharist. So the prayer of preparation, the two great commandments if they're used, the confession, which of course may be in the earlier position or the later position. Remember with the confession that there are some seasonal introductions to use for those, so different ones for the Easter season, the Christmas season, Advent season, and so on. And Reverend Lynn Easto will be going through with us later in the day how to find our way around the large edition prayer book. But it's important that you know how to use the prayer book and be familiar with finding the bits that you're going to need. Also the Gloria, the Psalm. So you would read the Gospel if there's no deacon present and the priest doesn't wish to read the Gospel. The Creed. It's important in introducing the Creed to actually read the words that are used in the prayer books. Sometimes I've noted that LPMs say, let us together affirm the faith of our church. Now, I know what they're wanting to say when they say that, but we're actually diminishing our church by using the word our, because it's not our church. The Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed belong to the Christian church. And the Nicene Creed in particular, which is a creed that is shared not only by the Roman Catholic Church, but the Orthodox traditions of the church as well, except for what's called the filioque clause, the words "and the Son" referring to the proceeding by the Holy Spirit. Those words were added by the Western Church a very long time ago, but they weren't in the original Nicene, what we call the Nicene Creed, and they've been a source of deep contention between us, the Western Church, and the Eastern Church ever since. But the Nicene Creed is essentially shared by the whole Christian family. The Apostles' Creed was originally a Roman baptismal creed, so that's more associated with the Western Church. But the point I'm making fundamentally is that the creeds are not Anglican creeds. They are creeds that are shared, reflect belief shared by Christians across the globe. So back to the parts you would do. You would also do the intercessions, potentially, if they're not being done by someone else. You might just note that at the end of the intercessions in the prayer book, we have the words, "Almighty God, you promised to hear our prayers." And generally, in my experience in our diocese, that is said by the presider, the presiding priest or bishop, although the prayer book doesn't specify that it has to be the priest, and there may be some different customs in different parishes about that. And then lastly, the dismissal. So they're the bits that, as the deacon of the Eucharist, you may be undertaking: the prayer of preparation, two great commandments, confession, Gloria, the Psalm, the Gospel, if there's no deacon and the priest doesn't wish to do the creed, the intercessions, and the dismissal. I'll just say a word about the Gospel. Traditionally, in 1662 service, the priest read the Gospel. In the period of liturgical renewal, in our more recent prayer books, that role has not been restricted to the priest. As the role of the permanent diaconate has been rediscovered and affirmed, the reading of the Gospel has come to be associated particularly with the role of the deacon, where there isn't a deacon present. then the LPM acting in the capacity as the deacon of the Eucharist would then read the gospel if the priest is not choosing to read the gospel themselves. So we're now going to run through preparing the altar table at the offertory. And just let me point out a couple of things first before Graham and I go through this. Thank you, Graham, for helping this morning and being very patient there. It's very helpful for you as an LPM to get a count of the numbers of people who are present. The priest normally will enter that in the parish register at the end of the service. And it's not always easy for a priest to be able to get a count of the numbers. So if you can do that at some point, that's very helpful. And you need then to give that number of people present to the presiding priest at the beginning of preparing the offertory, because that's when the priest will want that number to know how many wafers to have prepared. In some parishes, the first thing a priest likes to do is to have some hand sanitizer to sanitize their hands before they start touching vessels and the bread. So you want to have worked that out with the priest beforehand. So Graham, we're going to imagine this is the altar here now, and we are now preparing for communion. So I'm going to have some hand sanitizer first. So I'll use a little bit of that. Then you're going to pass me the chalice. In many parishes, it's a tradition to give a little nod to one another at the completion of an action. That's, again, a local custom thing to work out with your priest what he or she and you want to do about that. So I'll put the chalice down to the side. I'll set up the corporal. Take the pall off, the pattern, the purificated down. Can I just check with the cameraman that you can see okay here? Is that better? Okay, great. So Graham, I'll have some water and wine now. Very important to remember to take the stoppers out. We get to a blockage if the LPM's there with two stoppers in and you're the priest because you want the bread, the water and the wine, you don't want the stoppers in your hands. So I'll take some wine, and there's often a tradition of swapping the water to the other hand, so you're passing from your right hand. So I'll pour some water, some wine in the chalice, pass the cruet back, take the water cruet, put some water in, and I'll give a little nod. We also, by this stage, will know how many people are present. The priest will do a quick calculation about whether there's enough broken wafers in a big wafer or whether it's necessary to have some additional wafers on the pattern. Also, the priest will generally know if there are people who normally take gluten-free wafers. Let's pass the bread box over, Graham. Yeah. Yeah. So I will just imagine there's a couple of gluten-free wafers here. that I will put here in the event that we will need them, so we will consecrate them, have them available. Okay, so now we go to the ablutions, and as LPM, you'll put a lavabo towel over your left hand. Pour some water. Thanks, Graham. Give a little nod. And the last thing I like to do after the ablutions is to have some more hand sanitizer once again. So just a little bit of hand sanitizer. When you're doing that, if as an LPM you're squeezing the bottle for the priest, please make sure you don't squeeze a whole heap of sanitizer, because it's, I can tell you, it's pretty awkward to try and rub in a whole tablespoon of hand sanitizer if you're trying to do that. You just need a little bit of hand sanitizer on the hands so that the priest can quickly sanitize their hands with it. Okay, well, I think we're pretty done with that, Graham. Thank you very much. Graham, perhaps you could just move all the communion things back onto this table now. I think we'll give Graham a big clap for all his help this morning. Thank you very much, Graham. I just note at the bottom here, in some parishes there's a tradition of bringing the bread and the wine up from the back of the church, and if you're doing that, obviously that needs to happen right at the start of preparing for setting up for communion. Another thing to be aware of is where you will stand. Generally, you'd work that out with your parish priest. Often, parish priest will get you to stand at the side of the altar near to them somewhere. When we return to the practice of being able to share the wine again, then as an LPM, you would assist in administering the chalice. We used to have the practice, I don't know whether it'll resume, of intincting in some parishes. And obviously if that's happening, often you'd have two chalices, one for drinking and one for intincting. One of the things to bear in mind is if you're administering the chalice, and people in your church have a practice of standing to receive communion, it's important to think about the process of the person receiving the wine. If you're standing and they're standing, you're not going to be able to see the level of wine in the chalice. And it has certainly happened before that wine has been poured down the front of a lady. So you need to think about how you're going to manage that. And in my experience, the best thing to do is to confidently pass the chalice over to the person who's receiving communion and allow them to gauge the level of the wine. You can keep one hand on the chalice if you prefer to do that as they take the wine. If that's not something you've done before and you don't feel confident about it, I'd encourage you to practice with your priest or someone else and just become familiar with how to do that. It's important, obviously, to wipe the chalice well with a purificator after each person has had communion. So after communion, we go through the ablutions, and I think we'll relieve Graham of the task of having to come out again, and I'll just run through these things. They'll be pretty familiar to you. You want to take the stopper off the water cruet and bring that over to the presiding priest or bishops. Some priests may prefer a little wine as well. The priest will pour that into the chalice, a bit of wine into the chalice and a bit of wine onto the paten. Often the priest will get you to hold the water cruet and you'll do the pouring. And it's helpful if you don't pour too much water, because again, as the priest, if you find yourself having to suddenly consume half a chalice full of water, that doesn't look terribly dignified, and it's not very helpful. So you need enough water to be able to wash out the wine in the chalice, maybe a dessert spoonful, something like that, and enough water in the chalice, again, maybe half a dessert spoonful, something like that, for any remaining crumbs of the host to be caught in the water so they can be consumed. So then as the LPM, you will be ready to receive the chalice and the paten and the corporal. If you've got a basin of ale, that'll be on top of it as well. That'll be handed back to you by the presiding priest. In terms of other things, you'll need to be ready to do the dismissal. By that stage, you've probably had some notices, and the final hymn may be sung at this point, or it may have been done earlier. So as you move out, you'll acknowledge in most parishes the altar with the presiding priest, and then if there's just two of you, you would lead the way. As you would in procession coming into the church, you'd lead the presider or follow a crucifer if you have a crucifer. So when you come out of the church into the vestry, the priest will often say a little closing prayer with you at that point. They may say, "The Lord be with you," or some other prayer to conclude your ministry, action of ministry in that service in that way. You may then need to help prepare things for another service if you've been assisting at an early service and there's another one going to follow. It may be your role possibly to help prepare things for the next service. Certainly, it'll be your role to remove all the vessels from the credence table, and if there's no further service, to put all those away where they belong, and of course to wash appropriately the communion vessels. And it's very important to remember to boil a kettle and to use boiling water to thoroughly sterilize and wash the chalice and the paten. If there's some consecrated host that's going to be bread and wine, some reserved sacrament that's going to be retained for use in communion by extension, then obviously that needs to be put straight into an aumbry. One of the other little tips there is the importance of just handling the communion vessels carefully, and particularly chalices and patens. We've just at Wollaston College sent off a paten a few weeks ago to a silversmith to have some bends removed from it where it was accidentally dropped. It's easy to have happen, and silver is a soft metal, So treat the vessels carefully and try to make sure that you don't drop them. So we've got a few minutes left, and I'm just going to touch on a few things now about leading morning prayer. Probably most of you in city parishes won't find yourselves in the situation of doing this, but I'm conscious that many of our rural folk who are Zooming in will often be in the situation of assisting with the leading of morning worship, of morning prayer. Can I just check with our technology gurus that we've still got some Zoomers from the country? 20, okay. Well, that's good. Welcome, folk from the country. So generally, if you are leading morning prayer, you would be using the second order morning prayer. That's page 19 in APBA. Thank you, Mark. Again, as with the Eucharist, it's very important to prepare properly beforehand. And the morning prayer service has a number of options in it. And so it's particularly important that you've looked carefully at the service, read the rubrics through, and you work out exactly which parts of the service you will be using. Often, for those of you in the country leading a morning prayer service, or perhaps a prayer, praise and proclamation service, you'll be doing that because there isn't a priest present. And in that situation, you are the liturgy person for the day, and you need to be very clear about what you're going to do and what's going to happen in the service. Because you're responsible for exactly what will happen in the liturgy on that occasion. You will need to have arranged a musician, or someone else will have, and to have picked the hymns if there are going to be hymns in the service. So you need to have attended to those things, obviously. There's also the question of readers. Is there a roster of readers in your parish? Do you, if you're the LPM, do the readings? How's that managed? Make sure you're clear about who's doing the readings, and make sure that the Bible is prepared so that that's ready. It's important that you will have access to a lectionary, important that you know how to use the lectionary, so that you can find the readings for morning prayer, or if it's a Eucharist, the Eucharistic readings, as well as the psalm. So you need to go right through the service and, as I said before, choose exactly which options you're going to use, which sentences of scripture and so on. In the morning prayer service after the confession, there at section 7 is a declaration of God's forgiveness. And my reading of that is a declaration of God's forgiveness, not an absolution that only the priest would do. Father Jacob, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think section 7 in the prayer book is a declaration of forgiveness that the LPM can use. It reads, God desires none should perish, but all should turn to Christ and live. In response to his call, we acknowledge our sins. God pardons those who humbly repent and truly believe the gospel. Therefore, we have peace with God through Jesus Christ.
It says the minister, doesn't it?
Yes, says the minister.
It's not an
Yeah, yeah. So you may use that, but you may also use, or in addition, use a verse from Scripture. If anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous, and so on. That well-known passage from 1 John chapter 2. Under the ministry of the Word in the morning prayer service, there's a range of options that you can use, and your parish may have some traditions about that. So it'll be important to look at those and have them clear in your mind. You should use the psalm set for the day after the Old Testament reading. You may also use the canticle, the Song of the Church, on page 29 of the prayer book after the psalm. As an LPM, you can only preach if you are specifically authorised and licensed by the Archbishop to do that. That requires some theological study in order to be so licensed. But in place of the sermon, you may read a sermon that you have obtained from a priest or some other appropriate source. You may read a devotional piece, or you may have some discussion with the small group, as it'll often be in the country, of fellow worshippers about one or both of the readings. If you are going to have some discussion, it's important to be an effective coordinator of the discussion. You need to be careful about setting a time for how long you're going to do that and sticking to that, to be attentive to those who may be naturally quieter, to give them a chance to have a say, as well as the folk who are much more comfortable being vocal and eloquent. Someone may be rostered to lead prayers in your parish, or it may be your role to do them. Be clear about that. There are a lot of resources in APBA that you can use, and Reverend Lynn is going to be talking about some of those later today, particularly from pages 188 or 181 and following, and especially 188 and following in the prayer book. There's a section in the morning prayer service, section 22, that allows for people to come forward to receive prayer and the laying on of hands. And my suggestion would be not to do this unless you're quite experienced in pastoral ministry and you've discussed it with the wardens of the parish, and ideally also the priest who takes the Eucharist, or Bishop Jeremy, or Archdeacon Cathy. I say that because there are tricky pastoral situations that can arise in a context where people may be coming forward and asking for prayer. And it's important that that is handled appropriately. So if that's not something you feel you are well equipped to do, I would encourage you not to try and do that. If it is something that there is a desire for people to do, and you haven't done that before, I would discuss that with either your visiting priest when they come, or to contact Bishop Jeremy or Archdeacon Kate to discuss that. Archdeacon Cathy, rather. So the morning prayer service concludes with the final section, the sending out of God's people. And at section 28 there, you can use either the grace or the Aaronic blessing from the book of Numbers, and then the dismissal. Okay, so that concludes what I wanted to say today. And I'm now going to invite Father Jacob to come out, but as he does that, I invite us all to stand, stretch our legs for 60 seconds. Yeah. We'll repeat it. So are you okay just to stand there? Okay, thank you, everybody. Could we be seated again? So we've got about 15 minutes for, for some questions now before we go to morning tea. So it's over to you now to ask any questions you may like to ask. We're going to repeat the question when it's asked so that people in the country will be able to hear it as well.
I just wanted to check if there's a set place that the LPM should sit when the sermon's presented, because if it's at the front, you're facing the back of the minister, and if it's okay for sitting at that very front row so that you're then facing the minister presenting the sermon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So the question being asked was, is there a particular place where the LPM should be seated during the sermon? Being aware of the fact that if they stay in their normal place, they'll often be facing the back of the preacher. In my own parishes, my practice has been to encourage LPMs when I come across to preach the sermon to move at that point into a front row of the church so that they can see the preacher and engage with the sermon in that way. I don't know, Father Jacob, whether you've...
Yes, I would agree with that as well. And I've done that even as the priest, the presider.
Yes.
If I can't see the, and if it's a more informal kind of setting or more relaxed, I should say, I would definitely sit with others in the front pew.
Mary.
I would have thought in setting up the chalice to, if it's a cross on the chalice, to have that pointing outwards, and then the fold of the corporal facing outwards, and then it's handed to the priest in that way, so that the cross towards and the fold is towards the priest, so that when the altar is set up, it's all in the right order.
Okay, thank you, Mary. So Mary was making the point that she was taught to have the corporal with the cross on it, and the cross, if there's a cross on the chalice, facing the priest. Is that right, as you hand it to them? So that's a particular tradition that some parishes, Mary's from Applecross Parish, that's tradition there, and it may well be in a number of other parishes. So if that's something that you do in your parish, I certainly encourage you, to do that. In practice, I suspect there's some diversity, about that across different parishes in the diocese.
When we go back to putting the wine and intention, would you go over the procedure for if we run out when we're going along serving, then we run out of wine? Because that has happened.
Would you like to?
Sure. Well, as I
Just
mentioned,
repeat the question.
Oh, yes, of course. So the question is, correct me if I'm wrong, the question is, one, how do we go about with intention? What is the process for doing it? What is the procedure? Is that correct?
More about refilling the main chalice of wine as the LPM when you run out.
So replenishing the wine, if it is all spent, if it's all used up, how do you replenish the wine? So very good question. What would normally happen is that if some priests will have a little cruet, a small cruet of wine on the altar that they'll also consecrate, so that if you need to refill the chalice, you can refill it from that consecrated supply. If you've used that consecrated supply or the priest hasn't done that, what you'll need to do is really consult with your priest. And what the priest should do is then fill the chalice with wine, consecrate it again with the words of institution, and then and only then can it be administered. So we have very clear guidelines in our pastoral handbook that under no circumstance can wine or bread be distributed in communion without it being consecrated first?
So just on that, sorry, just to be clear, so then when we finished, there's no wine in my chalice.
Yes?
I've got to go back with the priest to have that done, yes?
Yes, you can either refill it with consecrated wine, if there is consecrated wine in a cruet set aside, or if there's none, then the priest will have to consecrate it.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I just wondered, this has happened with our church. What happens if someone's in Tilton and they drop the weight, not at the moment, basically, but if someone's in Tilton and they drop the wafer into the wine, what do you do then?
I'm going to hand that question to Father James.
So the question is, what happens if someone is intincting their host or wafer into the chalice and accidentally drop it in the chalice? What do you do then? Well, this is one of the reasons why we discourage intinction in the first place. Because things like this happen. And I'm not sure if you're familiar, but clergy in the Diocese of Perth have this handbook, this little manual that we used to call the Vade Mecum, which we'll now be calling the Pastoral Handbook. And the the Vade Mecum was issued by Archbishop Roger, but Archbishop Kay has now has been working on a revision of that, and that will be published very soon. And in that revision, it says that intinction is strongly discouraged. So hopefully it shouldn't be an issue.
Oh, well, I think it should be an issue. Look, I'm not here to throw a hand grenade, but the modern world is intinction, if done properly, surely is the way forward. I come from a parish where I think it's worked very well. I think we've had an amazing year last year where we've reviewed practice often, and to go back and think that the best practice is to drink from the cup, I just don't think it's the way forward. Intinction can be done reverently, liturgically correct, and it's highly appropriate, in my opinion.
So the comment, the feedback there was in some people's experience, intinction, when done well or when done properly, however that may be defined, works, and it is something that we should still perhaps consider continuing. Now, the answer to that is that there have been numerous medical and scientific studies already since the 80s about intinction, because intinction essentially became a practice as a result of the AIDS outbreak. There was a concern there that sharing the cup during that outbreak may have, may pose a danger to communicants. And what's interesting is that what a lot of those studies have shown, and in fact, we had a recent one, I think as recent, well, not as recent, but the most recent one that we've had in the Anglican Church of Australia was, I think, in 2001. And again, it affirmed what previous studies had shown, was that intinction was far more susceptible to passing germs than drinking from the chalice. Just think about what your hands do during the service. They sweat, they touch money, and put in the collection. You could be touching your face, touching prayer books or hymn books that have been touched by other people. And before the COVID restrictions, when was the last time they were wiped down? Could be scratching your nose, scratching your hair, and then suddenly you get a host, you dip it, and not only is the host dipped in, but often because you can't see all the way down the chalice, your fingers will go in for a swim as well. And underneath your fingernails, so it is primarily a health consideration why intinction is discouraged. Because yes, it can be done liturgically well, it can be done. Oh, sorry, yeah.
I think we would all encourage not to overfill a cup. I mean, there is a risk of the cup being spilt in passing it to people. The reality is, not a lot of wine needs to be placed in the cup for it to be safe to intend and to keep the hands well above the wine.
Yes, but again, there's no assurances, it depends, yes, so,
But there's no assurances that people's false teeth or pieces of teeth can fall in the cup. I mean, some
Yes.
parishes could be administering where it's very difficult when people are drinking from the cup. I think I've said enough, so.
yeah, no, thank
Okay,
you. It's,
thank you.
Clearly you've had people agreeing with that, so it's good to hear different.
Hang on, we'll get Mark first because he had his hand up next, and then we'll come to you.
Someone has asked from the country, Rachel has asked from the country, with WA now moving to stage 5 restrictions, and with the Archbishop always saying that in stage 5 there would be a review of communion in 1 kind to back to 2 kinds. Is there any guidance on when that might happen?
Sure, so the question is, now that we are heading towards moving to stage 5, will there be a return to the common cup? Because initially the Archbishop did say that as we head into that stage, that it will become more likely that they will return to the common cup. Now, the Archbishop actually had received a reply from the Premier and the Health Department about their recommendation as to whether we should return to a common cup. And the answer was that there is no legal impediment to us doing so, but they would highly discourage it. I can't imagine that they would ever encourage it given the current climate. And I think even before COVID-19, they probably wouldn't encourage it, just as they wouldn't encourage, that in schools or in hospitals. So the current position of the Archbishop is as she said in a most recent ad clerem, a letter to the clergy, she said, just hold on. We will keep the conversation going. We will see how this unfolds. But in the meantime, it is important to still administer communion in 1 kind.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. Down the back.
Could you just clarify for me the distinction between LPM and LA? 2 roles?
Okay. Perhaps I'll have a go at answering that, and Father Jacob can come in as well if he needs to. LPMs, the question is, what's the difference between LPMs in their role and a liturgical assistant? LPMs are specifically licensed by the Archbishop. LAs are licensed, authorised by their parish priest. So there's a fundamental difference in the process of authorisation. As it was originally conceived, the role of the liturgical assistant was essentially to help with the administration of communion. At the time I was on the senior staff meeting when those 2 roles were worked out and developed. And I have a clear recollection that that was the intention at that time. That has changed somewhat, I think, in practice in the diocese. Whether it should have or not, it has changed. And LAs now do fulfill a range of roles in many parishes in assisting in the liturgy, including effectively taking the role of a deacon of the Eucharist. So I think there's some tension there a little bit between what was envisaged as the ideal and what happens in practice. I think that would be my response.
Can I also add that as LPMs, you are licensed ministers of the church. This isn't, I mean, this is short of ordination. I hope that sort of paints a picture for you. So it is a very important role. It's a licensed role. It means that you are not representing yourself. Everything you do, everything you say, the kind of ministry that you offer as an LPM, you are doing that on behalf of the church and in the name of the Archbishop who has licensed you. So it is a significant role. And I think when we understand that, then we can understand how that relates to the the ministry of a lay assistant, of a liturgical assistant.
Thank you. I've got time for one last question.
My question then is, as LAs, if we don't have a priest, it should be an LPM that presides over the service, not the LA that having morning prayer. Is that correct?
So the question is that in the absence of a priest, is it the case then that it is an LPM rather than an LA who has to preside or take over or lead the service? And the answer is not only should, but actually must, strictly speaking, because LPMs and only LPMs are licensed to do that. And so I would encourage that if you have quite a few LAs in your parish and not enough LPMs, encourage them to step up and to take on an LPM license.
So, and clarify that includes morning prayer.
Well, okay, so the follow-up question is, does that include morning prayer? The answer to that is that if it is the principal service of your community on that Sunday, then yes, it needs to be the LPM. Yes, whether that be morning prayer, whether that be prayer, praise, prayer, and proclamation.
What about midweek?
Midweek, if it's morning prayer, an LA could, it depends how informal it is, but really, if you look at the license of an LPM, it says to read the services of the church, which strictly speaking means morning prayer and evening prayer. Weekdays a bit tricky because I think you just have to use pastoral discretion as to the kind of context that the service takes place in.
Okay, our time's up. We're going to need to draw things to a close there. So thank you everyone for your attention. It's been quite a long session. We're going to have morning tea now and we'll be back, please, for 11:15. We've got half an hour. Thank you. Thank you.